welcome to today's seminar with Brennpunkt Europa, EU-Russia Energy Security with Dr. Anna Herranz Surralles from Maastricht University. Most welcome. Let's give her applause. My name is Rebecca Lim. I'm a second-year master's student, European Studies, and Brennpunkt Europa is a student-led organization in cooperation with the Center of European Studies and the Center of European Research here at the university. Today's seminar is about EU-Russia energy security, and it will be live streamed. You can check out our own YouTube channel that has been posted on our Facebook page. You can also follow us live on Twitter. We will be tweeting live. And if you want to tweet yourself, we have a hashtag, which is BP with big letters, live, BP live. So, without further ado, we will leave the floor to Dr. Anna Herranz Surralles. Most welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me with, I have a loud voice. Thank you very much for inviting me. I've heard many good things about Brennpunkt. You've had a lot of nice speakers this year, and it's impressive that you can spend the lunchtime and come in great numbers. So it's a pleasure for me to give this talk. Following the instructions, I'll just talk for about half an hour, a bit less, and then follow your interest and take it from there. So I will put my presentation. And so, when thinking how to start to give this mini lecture, thought, well, I'm going to Scandinavia, to Nordic countries, so I'll start by probably you recognize where this image comes from. It's from the series Occupied, where the main plot, it may sound familiar to you, you may have seen it, is about the Green Party winning in Norway and deciding to phase out fossil fuels. Then the EU goes mad about it and allows Russian intervention in order to keep up production of hydrocarbons. So, of course, that's all fiction. But in a way, as in all fiction, there is a bit of reality in that. And I thought that I'd start by what do we see in this pop culture example that is relevant for us today. And of course, the first thing that strikes us is the EU's growing energy dependency. That's a growing concern. The EU is dependent on imports of gas for 65% of its consumption. And only 20 years ago it was 40, so it has been increasing fast. And projections are that dependency will be 85% in over 10 years. So the series taps into this growing concern about energy security for the EU. It is, of course, also showing the growing concern as well towards the main supplier. So the EU depends for a third of its gas imports on Russia, another third from Norway, and 15% or so from Algeria, and then the rest. But there is this perception that Russia is becoming less and less reliable in terms of being the main supplier of the EU. Of course, there were the crises of 2006 and 2009, but at that point, there was still this idea that the blame was more on the Ukrainian side than on the Russian side. Whereas from 2014, since the annexation of Crimea, this perception has also shifted. So now the view of Russia as an occupying force is also not that perhaps that far-fetched. Then we have this idea also in the series that energy is the thorn in the flesh of EU foreign policy, is what impedes what, the EU to play an active role in foreign policy. In the series, the EU is unable to act when Russia, in its invasion of Norway, goes a step further, and then the EU is unable to act. Also, the US in the series cannot intervene because they've stopped caring about EU affairs. So there is also a mention to that. And finally, of course, there is climate change. The whole trigger of the plot is a natural catastrophe because of climate change and all the mobilization that this causes. And we have this also in reality. For example, the reaction to the Fukushima disaster led to phase out nuclear energy in Germany, but that involves very complex trade-offs. Sometimes Germany is put as an example, but also the phasing out of nuclear energy has forced the country to burn more coal. So again, having a negative effect on climate. So here we see that there are these complex juggling acts that are also well reflected in the series. But going to reality, how has the EU tried to manage this growing the growing challenge of energy security? And I thought I would concentrate my talk in 4 strategies the EU is conceiving, and I will briefly just pass through those: the extension of the market, diversification, the tools of the internal energy market, and finally the energy union. Of course, we also have the renewable policy and energy efficiency. I won't talk that much about that, but we can of course discuss that in the open debate later on. So let's go to the first strategy. This has been the main one since the mid-2000s, but as I'll explain, not a particularly successful one. So as you may have followed, the EU has been following a process of liberalization of its own internal energy market, which means trying to, instead of managing energy relations as energy islands that each member state takes care via its own energy champions about supply, to try to provide the conditions in order that energy can flow whenever it is needed. So homogenizing the rules, liberalizing the sector, unbundling the energy companies, and also making interconnections. So building an integrated energy market. That, though, created fears that if you liberalize your internal energy market, it would be easier for companies, state-owned companies from outside the EU to acquire assets in the EU. So the first thought while liberalizing the EU energy market was, well, if we export our own rules to other countries, to transit countries and to producer countries, the problem will be solved because we will all abide by the same rules in a level playing field. This is something that the EU has tried to do, for example, in the energy community, that, as you see, involves the EU, but also the Balkan countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and then there are other countries that are about to join. So this has been successful in the sense that those countries have agreed to comply with EU energy acquis, not only the past acquis, but any acquis that comes further. So it's a quite revolutionary concept of integrating countries in one part of the EU activity. The level of compliance is, of course, very much up to discussion, but that extension of the regulatory space has been to some effect. But as you see here, it has not been of any success in integrating producer countries in integrating Russia or the Mediterranean producer countries, Algeria, Libya, but not even Norway. So the proposal of the EU to have, beyond the energy community, what is called the Energy Charter Treaty, has never been fully agreed by producer countries. So we see that first strategy, bringing your regulatory space outside, has not had the effect, at least towards producing countries. So the second step from the EU's point of view was, well, if we cannot export our rules, let's at least try to diversify away from Russia in order to reduce our vulnerability. And here, probably you've heard of the Southern Corridor, which the main pipeline was the Nabucco pipeline, and also there is a lot of talk going on about LNG. So I'll go through both. On the Nabucco pipeline, so the idea was to bring gas from the Caspian region and further away, because also there was the idea of bringing from Turkmenistan, Iran, and maybe Iraq directly to the EU. The Nabucco pipeline was initially only considered for Azerbaijan, and it was only 10 billion cubic meters of gas. Just to give you a perspective, this is a tiny, tiny proportion of what the EU consumes, which is in between 400 and 500 BCM, so 10 of this is not much, and Russia only exports to the EU 150 or so. So 10 is a little contribution to that, but the gas would go to an area of the European Union that we can see in this map in red is the most dependent region of the most dependent countries on Russian gas supply. So by bringing an alternative source of gas to this region would already enable those countries to reduce their vulnerability. However, though, this was very much conceived in by the Commission and those supporters. It was conceived as it called a merchant pipeline, as almost as a highway that would be independent from the Turkish pipeline system, in order that it could not happen, that the same that happens now with Ukraine, that Ukraine can potentially siphon off gas that is going to the EU. The idea was that that Turkey wouldn't have that role; it would be independent from Turkey. But that was actually not accepted by Azerbaijan and Turkey, that agreed to do the TANAP. So these in blue. So they agreed to do a normal pipeline, and then only from here up to the EU could be the Nabucco. But then not even that was eventually possible. Instead of the Nabucco, the final project chosen, which is now under already in a quite advanced phase of planning, was this Trans-Adriatic pipeline, which quite coincidentally is made up by the same consortium that explores the gas here. So this idea of having a revolutionary concept of a pipeline that could be used independently by all those countries and just ship the gas through Central Europe was not accepted. There are several reasons for this, and of course, yeah, the lukewarm support by some member states to the project is one factor, but also the fact that, as you see from Azerbaijan and other Caspian producers, is much less sensitive to just ship your gas to Italy, where you do not compete with Russian supplies, than to challenge Russian supplies in Central and Eastern Europe. So again, the issue of diversification, at least in this case, it hasn't that much worked out because the project Nabucco was filed just over 2 years ago. Then, of course, there is this idea that LNG could be then potentially the solution. And here you have the operational capacity of, in terms of BCM. And again, we see that at least the existing capacity is for countries that have already a quite diversified supply. There is very little LNG capacity in this part of the EU. There is a lot planned, as you can see, Poland, Lithuania, and some of the LNG plants are operational already in some of these countries, also plant in Croatia. Sweden has also built some LNG, or has 4, I think, LNG terminals, but very small scale, so they are not even indicated in this table. But what happens with, if you look at the quantities, is that this idea of increasing so much the capacity of LNG is premised on the idea that this will become the fuel of the future. For the moment, LNG is much more expensive than pipeline gas. And there is much more capacity than it is actually used in the end, because just gas imports via pipeline is cheaper. For example, Spain, with 69 BCM, it only consumes Spain 30. So it has a double capacity of LNG than what is actually used. So only a tiny portion of that is used. This means that it's a very expensive insurance policy, so it increases your options. But also for example, in Spain, which is also where I come from, investors do not take any risk when doing the investment. So this means that capacity is constructed ahead of need, and this eventually has to be recovered in the prices for consumers, or of course for the taxpayers. So we have this seems to be, or the EU seems to invest a lot in this, but again, there is this discussion on whether actually do we need all this capacity, and also it means locking in further fossil fuels instead of diversifying away from gas. The export of rules not fully successful, the diversification also not either. Then what the EU has come up with in the last couple of years is, okay, then let's use the power, our own rules, to block projects that increase our dependency from Russia. And here there are 2 main pipelines you may have heard of, particularly the Nord Stream 2 and the South Stream 1. And both are an example of a different trend, which I am presenting in a minute. So the South Stream. So the South Stream, you have it indicated here in blue. We have already seen the Nabucco. The Nabucco was in this one in red. And so the idea of both projects, both the Nord Stream and the South Stream, are to bring directly gas from Russia to the EU without having to pass through Ukraine or Belarus, which is also a transit country. If the one or the other would be built, because there is the Nord Stream 1 was already operational since 2011. And the idea is that if Nord Stream 2, so doubling capacity of the Nord Stream, or constructing this direct pipeline here, would allow Russia to eliminate any supplies via Ukraine. So it's a diversion pipeline instead of new capacity. So that for the South Stream deemed that, and as you see, this is a competitor of the Nord Stream of the Nabucco that was proposed. So it was one or the other in this case. And the Commission took the very hard line that that most of the intergovernmental agreements between Russia and the countries part of the South Stream that we see here, mainly Bulgaria, which was the entry point, that these IGAs, intergovernmental agreements, were illegal because they were not applying EU regulations, for example, unbundling. In the unbundling system, the producer cannot be at the same time the owner of the network. And in this case, Russia would be supplying the gas and would also own 51% of the pipeline once in Europe. And that is against the rules of unbundling, but also third-party access. For the EU, any pipeline should allow capacity from other producers, and here it would be 100% Russian gas. So the Commission said, well, this cannot go through. Bulgaria and other countries tried to avoid that, but in the end, because of all the legal hurdles, but then also again because of the context in EU-Russia relations after the invasion of Crimea, the project was stopped. So we could say that in this case is one of the examples of the EU, the Commission, showing its teeth and being able to block one of those projects. However, when we look at the Nord Stream currently under discussion, and that has probably made headlines in Sweden, because the pipeline passes through the territorial waters of Sweden. In this case, the Commission acted in the same way, saying that this pipeline would have the same problems, not being in accordance with the EU law, and not being in the EU strategic interest, because this is, again, not new gas. It's only to divert supplies that now are going via Ukraine and then exposing all the countries in Central and Eastern Europe to supply cuts more easily than if this pipeline now going via Ukraine is the same that actually supplies Germany and Western Europe. But even with that, member states in favor, via their companies, they have showed no willingness to back down on this, and in principle the Nord Stream 2 is still up there. So the Commission may have some leverage, but actually only when the member states play along. We have this uncertain situation because in the end Poland took the things on its own and decided to challenge the pipeline in Poland in the anti-competitive, in the anti-monopoly agency, and the anti-monopoly agency of Poland ruled that this pipeline was not in accordance with the rules, and that if it would be built, the companies involved in it, E.ON, BAS, Wintershall, Engie, so the European companies would be fined for all their assets in Poland, which are quite numerous. So now the companies might pull off, but Russia said that we'll build anyway, even if it's on its own, the pipeline. So again, we have a little bit of a mixed results in that. And finally, the energy union that you may have heard a lot. There are particularly two aspects of the energy union that are of concern when we talk about EU-Russia relations and energy security. The first one is on controlling these intergovernmental agreements on energy, and the second, whether we can have stronger solidarity mechanisms in the EU in the event of a supply crisis. So on the IGAs, the proposal, and as we've mentioned, these intergovernmental agreements are always between a member state and a foreign supplier. And sometimes these IGAs are in violation of the EU law, but sometimes also, even if there is no violation, they can have adverse effects on the security of other member states. So there was, from 2012 onwards, a mechanism whereby member states are obliged to communicate to the Commission any IGA. And the idea was that the Commission could have the power to say, well, let's proceed with this IGA or not, to have a vetting power. That was not accepted by the member states in 2012, but in 2016, the Commission and the Parliament put that again into discussion, saying, well, we really need that to avoid situations like the South Stream, where a member state adopts an IGA that is not in accordance with EU law, and then it cannot be changed. And if it is changed, then Russia could bring this country to arbitration, because it's an international agreement that has also a value in international law. So to avoid that, the Commission is asking again to have this power of ex-ante approval of IGAs. And another development is that it is asking not only to have a power over the IGAs, the formal ones, but also non-binding agreements. And that is because since the 2012 regulation was put in place, most of the member states stopped having IGAs and only having informal agreements, which means that in the end you are not obliged to inform about it. And then the Commission was of course aware of that and also proposed that. This anticipates very fierce discussions in the Council. The EP is very much in favor, but probably we are going to see that member states are not willing to concede in all of this. And finally, solidarity mechanisms. It is also another field where we see the Commission trying to go a step further, and in these early proposals in February, the Commission has proposed a kind of mutual defense clause in the energy domain, saying that if some country would be under an emergency in terms of supply, there would be the obligation to provide this country with energy. All the countries in the EU, but also actually includes the members of the energy community. So we've seen the neighboring countries, including Ukraine, into that. So all the regional plans would have to be made up in a way that it is always possible, for example, via reverse flow, so that the pipelines go in two directions in order to be able to help that. But that is very much favored by the countries that are on the red side of that map that we saw, but not that much from the countries that are not vulnerable. And these debates about solidarity may sound familiar to you. It's those countries who have invested in LNG, for example, Spain, saying, why do we need to go and save others if we have invested so much money and that has been expensive to us? So it's a bit self-help logic, just do it or just build up more renewable capacity. So now there are all these nasty discussions going on in this regard. So it is up for discussion. What do you think about it? But probably we will end up with more flexible mechanisms than this compulsory obligation to supply countries in need. So just to end, to summarize what we've seen that there are these main strategies. Not any of them are particularly successful, but the EU certainly is much better placed now than it was 10 years ago to face a supply disruption and to deal with the challenge of overdependence on suppliers. But as a way of conclusion, what we see is that the EU has this always thought about this energy triangle, where the competitiveness, affordability goals, security, and sustainability are in this virtuous circle. They all reinforce each other. But actually, when we think of all the way outs, they involve a lot of trade-offs. If we think of reverse flows, further LNG, shale gas, that of course has negative consequences for affordability and competitiveness, and obviously also for the sustainability side. When the proposals for setting up renewable, so to increase the targets of renewables and efficiency are also seen in times of crisis for some member states as not feasible. And that's why even the member states in 2014, they could not agree on national targets for after 2020. So the level of ambition is also decreasing because of these problems, trade-offs on the other side. And then, nuclear energy, clean coal technologies. This is a debate that has been very much strong in Sweden. And you also know the trade-offs under discussion, and this idea of wanting to phase it out, but in the end choosing not to do so because of considerations on the other regards, competitiveness, but also in terms of emissions. So this is just as a way of conclusion that things are very complex when we talk about energy, but I very much look forward to your questions and ideas. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Thoughts? Yes. Yeah, go ahead. I'll give you a mic.
Thank you. My name is Kirill. I'm actually from Ukraine, and I just have an opinion to say about like the Russian-Ukrainian relations. And I think you mentioned that like the southern stream and northern streams were built to minimize the kind of stealings or gas, which might be true. I have no information on that. But like for us, it's more like the political tension between the countries, and Russia was like increasing the gas prices for Ukraine, and Ukraine was paying more than Germany, for example, for gas. And like in the back pressure, Ukraine tried to increase the transit prices to just counteract with governmental level. So I guess that is the opinion on that strategy. And actually have a question, like in the unlikely scenario if Russia cuts supplies for the European Union, is there an estimation of like how long will the industry work or something with all the reverse system and everything? So how long will the union function actually? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Shall I reply immediately? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry if you got the impression that I said that that the main goal is to avoid Ukraine using its transit to exert some pressure. But it's so the point was that always when there are transit countries, that increases the risk, no matter whether it is Ukraine or it is Turkey. And of course, in the current situation of Ukraine and Russian relations, for Russia, Ukraine has become a problem, a political problem, and the other way around. So that's the strategy of Russia was always, after the fall of the Soviet Union, was to acquire the transit pipelines in the countries that were formerly of the Soviet Union, of Ukraine, of Belarus, which are the two main pipeline routes to the EU. This was successful in the case of Belarus. Russia managed to buy half of the network, and then the problem was solved. But Ukraine always resisted selling its own transit network to Ukraine. Then when political relations turn sour, energy is always a factor. So the fact that if you cannot acquire assets, the strategy by Russia has been, okay, then let's bypass the problem. That is something that the geopolitical consequences of that are very serious, and that's why in the EU, many of the countries and the Commission do not want these diversion pipelines, because then this leaves Ukraine, but also part of the EU, much more exposed. So there is a lot of, there is a very much the concern that this is not what should be happening, because actually it is much cheaper to modernize this network, or even to add capacity, than to build pipelines that are over 20 billion investment. So it's a very expensive policy for geopolitical reasons, rather than doing that. Your second question was.
How long the union will survive without?
Yeah. Thank you. And that actually there has been the EU in the framework of the Energy Union and also the Energy Security Strategy. The EU did some stress tests on how much, in the scenario of a complete shutdown of Russian supplies, what that would imply for the EU. And the result was that that it could even last for 6 months. But that's because, so different to the 2009 crisis when only 2 weeks of interruption of supplies, it meant that, that half of the EU countries, a bit less, they were completely without supply. So it took really the EU by surprise. That was the wake-up call. Since then, the reverse flows plans, but also storage capacity policy. So not all countries have the possibility to storage gas in underground storage facilities. But there is also the ability to share those deposits. So in the extreme event of complete stop of supplies and a cold winter spell, the EU could last up to 6 months. So some countries would suffer a bit more than others, and that's why the Commission is trying to strengthen these rules of solidarity. But the backside of this is that it would be very, very expensive. As you rely more on LNG and on reverse flows and on spot gas rather than on a long-term indexed oiled gas, this would mean so all solutions technically exist now, different to 2009, but it would be a very huge cost in terms of prices going up. So that's also not a positive scenario. Mm-hmm.
Any more questions? Yeah.
First of all, thanks for the great talk. And I have a question on oil companies. I don't know if you mentioned it or not, but there are big oil companies who started before COP21 and after COP21 to change their long-term strategy into producing more gas than oil, for example. Is this something you consider in your studies, or like in a long-term perspective, which would also diversify gas supply, or is this nothing you really concern?
Yeah, well, there is for sure a trend towards diversifying their own portfolio. So big energy companies, as you may have seen, they are not only in the hydrocarbon business right now, but all big energy companies do have growing interest in renewable energy.
Sorry, I think I said it wrong, but I'm talking about like big oil, like only oil companies, like for example Shell or BP. So they see the trend that like in mid-term or long-term future, cars won't rely on oil that much more. They try and to go into the energy sector more, like to provide gas, for example.
But most of them already do, and the companies you mentioned, yeah, Shell or BP have big gas explorations. They are also into the sector of shale gas. And growingly into renewables. So that's very right what you're mentioning, that big oil companies, or initially oil companies, are putting their eggs into different baskets in order to be able to tap into whatever that comes in the future. But that makes this the classical image we have that well, the big hydrocarbon companies, so the bad guys, and the renewable companies, the good guys. That picture is starting to blur and makes all decisions about, for example, how much subsidies should states give on renewable energies or not, very difficult. Again, also in Spain, there have been a lot of subsidies on renewable companies, and that's in principle a welcome development. But at the same time, it means that many of these big companies having stakes in renewable energies made big windfall profits. Even more than they what should be getting. So the debate is getting more and more complex. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out.
thanks for your interesting lecture. My question would be regarding the Arctic. How do you see potential future energy extraction up in the Arctic as the potential to replace Russia, or is Russia even getting stronger through that? What is your view on that? Thanks.
Yeah, it has been hot discussion in the last couple of years since Russia put that flag on the continental area of its the continental shelf of Russia, saying, well, this is ours, and we want to we plan on future hydrocarbon development here. But despite all this, it has remained quite quiet and controlled for the moment. It is true that there might be a lot of hydrocarbon resources laying in the Arctic, but it's for the moment not something that is urgently discussed as something that could happen in the next few years. What is more interesting, though, is to see how the shipping lanes for the transport of hydrocarbons, how that could affect world gas and energy trade, rather than direct exploration of the area. Because still in that part, Russia has some explorations in the area, but that you can imagine that this requires even icebreakers to get into the facilities. It's not something that in the current period of very low energy prices, these kind of investments are only possible in the context of sustained high oil prices. So if that comes in the future, then maybe the debate will be reopened again, because the debate started when the massive increase in oil prices took place in the mid-2000s until 2012 or so. It's when that was economical to consider.
Any final thoughts, questions? Someone has in mind? We have about 1-2 minutes left. Maybe a final analysis. Do you really think energy union is possible for EU to achieve?
Well, that depends on what we consider the energy union to be. Currently, it is only an umbrella concept to integrate the different strands of EU energy policy, and it is a long-term process to achieve the integration of the energy market, to achieve more renewables, and to have this more common unified approach to external energy relations. But my take on it is that for the next it's difficult to put a perspective on that, but what we are going to see in the next couple of years is just a tug of war between the member states, the Commission, between some member states, those more vulnerable, the less vulnerable, into making this into the energy union that was envisaged at the beginning. But yeah, it's difficult to picture that scenario.
I think we will conclude the seminar by thanking Dr. Anna Herranz Surralles for being here with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very
Yeah.
interesting.
No,
We've been talking about it a lot.